let's start in on this conversation by addressing the big topic, technocracy. What is technocracy? And obviously you lay out the history, you from the philosophical inception of this idea in the 18th, 19th centuries through its creation in the 20th century. But let's talk about a definition that comes from one branch of technocracy known as Technocracy, Inc., that is cited in this book. You say, quote, or actually, the technocrats say, technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population of this continent, North America. For the first time in human history, it will be done as a scientific, technical, engineering problem. Can you expand a little bit on that definition and this idea of technocracy and how it relates to people's lives today?
Oh, I sure can. You have to go back in history. Yeah, it's a broad question when you say let's apply it to our current day, but you have to go back in history and look at the original model for technocracy that was developed in the 1930s in particular. And there was an organization called Technocracy, Inc. that was formed by a couple of people after they were booted from Columbia University. There was a brief stint where the technocracy movement was housed at Columbia. They got support from Columbia for, doing a couple of continental water studies and stuff. And many of the engineers and scientists that were part of technocracy were from Columbia University. Not all, but most. They got booted for a couple of reasons, mostly because the co-founder, Howard Scott, turned out to be disingenuous, kind of a promoter type, and he didn't represent himself correctly and didn't have the PhD that everybody assumed he had. And so Columbia didn't put up with that very long. They said, hey, man, you lied to us once, you're out of here. And so they started this organization called Technocracy, Inc., and that's really where we see the main documentation now that was created for the technocracy model that I believe is being implemented today in today's world. It was based on energy. They believed that capitalism was dead. It was right in the heat of the Great Depression. They thought that politicians were responsible for killing capitalism because, well, people are angry with politicians today too, right? So what's going on? But they didn't have any use for politicians whatsoever. And the scientists and engineers at Columbia, and by the way, I'm not bashing all scientists and engineers. That's not the intent here. There were a few that bought into this at the time. They believed that because technology had come into society, that the very fabric of society had changed. And therefore, the politicians were unable to manage society because they didn't understand the technology. That was their reasoning, basically. So as a group, they stood up and says, if we don't step in as scientists and engineers and do something about this to save society from itself, society's going to crumble. And, World War II or World War III is going to, come about immediately, and the world's going to destroy itself. And you have to remember, too, this is all on the heels of World War I, which was really the first mechanized war that used technology in the history of the world. And it was appalling for everybody, but especially for the scientists and engineers who took the blame for creating the technology that was used in World War I. So they had they were suffering under a guilt trip right at that point. So they developed this energy-based economic model that was literally based on energy, not on price, not on supply and demand like traditional economics. And they believed that they could use the scientific method to engineer society in a way that it would create a utopia, essentially. It was very much a utopian system.
All right, folks, that is, of course, Patrick Wood of Technocracy.news, providing the bare bones of a basic start to an answer of that question, what is technocracy? And as usual, I would like to exhort you to go to the show notes for today's episode at corbettreport.com/QFC-technocracy in order to find the link to that full interview so you can listen to that answer in its entirety and the conversation in its entirety, and then exhort you to go and continue to listen to the other conversations that I've had with Patrick Wood on the subject of technocracy, and then go find some of those other conversations I'm referencing about technocracy with other guests and the other articles and videos and interviews I've done. But perhaps more to the point, we should start drilling down on the sources of this information, because that is where you're going to find the most information, the most valuable information, the most real information to answer this question. And as Patrick Wood stated, well, as I stated in the warm-up to that question with Patrick Wood, of course, he did provide an answer to that question of what is technocracy right there in his book. So let's go and take a look at the book, Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. And indeed, in the introduction, you will see the pull quote at the very beginning of the introduction is this definition: technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. All right, there is a one-sentence, very short summary of a very large idea. So where does that come from? Well, there's a footnote there. Let's go to the footnote and see if we can determine where this is coming from. So we'll turn over to this page where, we've got this reference. Footnote number 2, what is technocracy? From The Technocrat, Volume 3, Number 4, 1938. That's right. Again, people may not know, technocracy is an historical movement that took place and really arose and gained popularity in the 1930s. As Patrick Wood elaborates in that conversation, there's much more to the story, the history of how it developed and by whom and in what way, and how it became a movement, literally Technocracy Inc., etc. But leaving that to the side, again, there's plenty more information in that interview and in this book. But let's take a look at the official publication of the Technocrats, The Technocrat, Volume 3, Number 4. So let's go to a real search engine this time, not Google. And let's take a look. The Technocrat, Volume 3, Number 4. All right, let's do it live. And we'll type that in, and lo and behold, right off the top from archive.org, we have a couple of different editions of this. Let's take a look at this one. And as usual, with archive.org, you're going to have an actual copy of this actual magazine from 1938? 1937? Well, anyway, somewhere around there. This is The Technocrat, Volume 3, Number 4. And as was advertised, yes, here is the little What is Technocracy essay. So let's take it straight from the Technocrat's mouth and go and read this little passage where it says, the advance of technology on the North American continent through the ever-increasing use of extraneous, other than human, energy is bringing about the first major social change in history. Technocracy is not agitating for this change, it is preparing for it. Technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population of this continent, specifically North America, although I'm sure it plans to expand there in the 1930s. For the first time in human history, it will be done as a scientific, technical, engineering problem. There will be no place for politics or politicians, finance or financiers, spelt with 2 E's. Is that an old variant of the spelling that I don't know about? Rackets or racketeers. Technocracy states that this method of operating the social mechanism of the North American continent is now mandatory, because we have passed from a state of actual security into the present status of a state of actual scarcity into the present status of potential abundance, in which we are now held to an artificial scarcity forced upon us in order to continue a price system which can distribute goods only by means of a medium of exchange. Technocracy states that price and abundance are incompatible. The greater the abundance of the smaller the price. In a real abundance, there can be no price at all. Only by abandoning the interfering price control and substituting a scientific method of production and distribution can an abundance be achieved. Technocracy will distribute by means of a certificate of distribution available to every citizen from birth to death. The technate will encompass the entire American continent from Panama to the North Pole because the natural resources and the natural boundaries of this area make it an independent, self-sustaining geographical unit. Technocracy's blueprints have been designed for this continent and for no other. It is an American plan for the American continent. No imported political philosophies, including democracy, are in any way applicable. 1940 or before is the calculated date for the breakdown of the price system, dictating the need for the technate. Ah, you gotta love these predictions. This calculation is based upon the relentless, inevitable increase in the use of extraneous energy as a substitute for human labor. By 1940, there will not be enough money in pay envelopes to purchase the goods produced. Yep. Yes, 82 years and counting. Here we go. The government is already making up the difference with money raised by borrowing and taxation. There is a limit beyond which this cannot go. The financial collapse of private industry and of government, which will accompany the approaching social change, will be a symptom and not a cause. Lesson 21 of Technocracy study course states, the welfare of the human being involved is of ultimate and paramount importance. Every individual of the American continent will, under Technocracy, achieve a standard of living with security from birth to death that is wholly impossible, even for the most favored citizens today. All right, this is what the technocrats were saying, at least in their publicly available propaganda material from 1937. This is what they were actually writing themselves. And yes, Patrick Wood was not making that quote up. Technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population of this continent. That was the aim. That is the goal. That is how they define it. But you will notice even that one sentence is not the full picture, because what they start to get into is prices and energy and distribution and some sort of certification system for every citizen of the technate from birth to death. As you can see, there is a sort of a broader picture being painted here. Yes, it is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods. But there implied in that is not just societal change, governmental change, economic change, monetary change, changes in distribution and production. There is an entire system here, and there is a clue to where we can find out more about this here in this last paragraph, where they mention Lesson 21 of Technocracy study course states blah, blah, blah. Well, what Bible are they citing from here? What is this Technocracy study course that they're talking about? Well, again, we do not have to take we don't have to speculate about it. We can just search for it. Technocracy study course. Let's see if we can find this document. Does it exist? Oh yeah, there it is. It's all over the place. Now, there are a number of different editions of this that you can find in various places. Let's take this one as a representative example. So, Technocracy study course. So this, as I say, this has been produced many times over the years. There are different editions that came out of it. I believe 5 editions. But anyway, this was originally written by M. King Hubbert of Hubbert's Peak, aka Peak Oil fame, who was working with Howard Scott in the bowels of Columbia to birth this, what ultimately became a movement, and went on to found Technocracy Inc. with Scott and wrote the Technocracy study course, etc. Actually, this is a hardly legible version, and I know there are other versions out there, so let's see if I can bring up a more legible version of this. Technocracy study course. Hang on, folks. This is how it's done. This is how the sausage is made.
A few moments later.
Okay, so we have this edition, which I believe will be more legible. All right, so Technocracy study course. Let's take a look at this. Let's look through the table of contents to get an idea of what the Technocracy Inc. movement was doing and saying, and the way that it wanted to indoctrinate its new recruits into this movement. So we have this table of contents. Let's zoom in a little bit so we can read it better. And it starts off, well, again, around the sorts of themes that you might think about if you think with regards to technocracy. It's technology and government, right? So, an introduction to science, and they start talking about matter, change of physical states, molecules, the elements, atoms, etc. Okay, units of measurement, all right, energy, potential energy, kinetic energy, etc. The laws of thermodynamics, engines, definition, efficiency, heat value of fuels. All right, so this does seem a very technical sort of manual at this point. Then we get the human engine. Well, that's a strange way of putting that, isn't it? Calories, heat value of foods, efficiency of the human engine. Okay, Mr. Technocrat, the human engine. The flow of energy on the Earth, dynamic equilibrium among energy-consuming devices, energy in human history, early stages in the use of extraneous energy, modern industrial growth curves, mineral resources. All right, you could start to see where this is coming from and the sort of philosophy that might be behind this. Taylorism, which is something that we cite in that interview with Patrick Wood that he writes about, one of the philosophical precursors to technocracy. This idea of the scientific management of industrial production. Those ideas were certainly floating around in early 20th century. They did not originate from the technocracy movement. And one could see how people in the midst of the crisis of the Great Depression would be floundering about looking for any sort of new system of production, distribution, of control of energy, of economics that will save the population from the crisis that, as we know, by 1940, no one will be able to afford everything. The collapse of the system will happen and everyone will be in the technate.
There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better. Okay. What to do about mass unemployment? This is going to be a massive social challenge. And I think ultimately we will have to have some kind of universal basic income.
Would you live in a greener lifestyle if you could make money from it?
That may be possible if a government proposal for personal carbon emissions allowances is implemented under the scheme. Everyone in the UK would be allocated an annual carbon allowance.
Stored electronically, rather like a supermarket loyalty card, points would be deducted every time we buy or use non-renewable energy. For example, using electricity to power appliances in the home.
Or travelling somewhere by plane.
Or even buying petrol for your car on the forecourt.
Now, any points left over could then be sold back to a central bank. Are you still with us? And people who need more, like motorists who had used their allocations, could then pay for a top-up.
The Behavioural Insights team co-authored a report with Sky, a major UK licensed broadcaster, to talk about how Sky could nudge people into climate change behaviour. And not just Sky, but the recommendation was that other UK broadcasters should adopt these techniques. And the sorts of techniques they talked about were including news segments. So just to clarify, that's saying that there should be items in the news that will lead people to change their behaviour and climate.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? What are they consuming on the platform? So, individual carbon footprint tracker. Stay tuned. We don't have it operational yet, but this is something that we're working on.
Initially, the notion of a goal-oriented ledger may be user-driven. As an organization, Google would be responsible for offering suitable targets for a user's ledger. Whilst the notion of a global good is problematic, topics would likely focus on health or environmental impact to reflect Google's values as an organization. Once the user selects a volition for their ledger, every interaction may be compared to a series of parallel options. If one of these options allows the ledger to move closer to its goal, it will be offered up to the user. Over time, by selecting these options, the user's behavior may be modified and the ledger moves closer to its target.
Oh, that's right. All of the things that were being proposed in the Technocracy study course by Technocracy Inc. 90 plus years ago, all of that is actively being worked toward right now. And all of the various elements of the agenda that would support the creation of a technate are in play at the moment, from universal distribution of income to every citizen of the technate, to plans to socially engineer the technate through the most scientific processes, to the idea of rationing energy credits. And you get your allotment of energy credits, and you can use them to buy anything that we produce as part of our grand plan for the economy. You can see all of the various elements of the agenda, but unless you have the word and the actual historical details of the literal movement that existed strongly back in the 1930s, it still exists, but not really, but strongly existed in the 1930s, but the ideology behind that, which has continued on, unless we can identify that, we will never be able to properly confront it because people are still using outdated terminology to try to identify things that are not what they say. This is not fascism. This is not communism. This is a different conception of not just governance, not just economic production, not just monetary system, and not just the social fabric of human society, but all of those things are being radically altered under our very noses by technocrats who themselves may or may not know anything about this historical lineage of what it is they're working towards. In fact, I can almost guarantee you that most of these low-level whatever bankers or whoever know nothing about this history, but they are working towards an ideology that they undoubtedly adhere to, and that has to do with that ideology that we were looking at of treating the human cattle, the human machine, the human animal to be managed and controlled, and we push the right buttons and we get them to do this, we get them to do that. That is the underlying ideology behind all of the connecting so many of these different threads back to the same clique. Anyway, this is Technocracy, and I hope you can understand, after at least starting to just sort of get under the surface of this question of what is technocracy. There's plenty more to be said, but this is how we can get some of that information out, and I hope you will understand it is an important, valuable task to truly answer a question like this. Not to go off of what we assume we think that we free associate with that word. No, what is this actual word? Where does it come from? What does it imply? Economically, governmentally, socially, civilizationally, for the future of the human species. How can we identify that threat? And then, of course, the question is always, well, what do we do once we identify that threat? And I have talked about that before as well. Solutions to technocracy. I'll include some links towards that if you are interested in pursuing that. But this isn't Solutions Watch. This is Questions for Corbett, and I have just answered the question, what is technocracy? There will be plenty of show notes and plenty of meat on those bones for you to dig into if you are so inclined. So please have at it. CorbettReport.com/QFC-technocracy. I hope to see you there at CorbettReport.com. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the very near future.